So when we think a little bit now about how harmonization has been done and how harmonization will most likely be done as we go forward into the 20th century, I think it behooves us to step back for just a minute and remember a little bit of what has happened in the how of harmonization. You've heard me mention several times ICH, or the International Conference on Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. That's its official title, and I think you can see why we refer to it as ICH. As I've mentioned, it started in early 1990s. It involved the regulators and the innovative industry associations from the European Union, from Japan, and from the United States. From the beginning, Canada, Switzerland, and the World Health Organization were technically called observers, but they participated as equally as did the regulators from the EU, Japan, and the US. And I think anyone who knows the history of ICH and has followed the history of ICH would say that Canada and Switzerland have been as equal a partner in this effort as have the regulators from the three original major players. The work of ICH has focused, as its title, on the technical requirements for registration, looking at different aspects of efficacy, safety, quality, and then what were called mixed disciplines. I think it's important for people to realize that when we talk in ICH speak, that when the word safety is used and talking about safety guidelines, they're really talking about preclinical safety. So this is really the animal toxicology piece of drug development, that the efficacy piece really is the clinical efficacy and safety. It's really the clinical data from which you form your benefit risk clinical profile. Quality is obviously manufacturing quality, and as the history has been in the areas that were part of ICH, these are the three areas in which all of the regulators previously in their own laws were following as the basic requirements. And I think as we get to the end of this particular discussion, when we start talking about the rise of health technology assessment, the rise of cost effectiveness data, the rise of comparative effectiveness data, you can begin to see here that was never, and up to this point in time, it has not been a requirement for market access. Market access regulation is based on clinical efficacy and safety, preclinical safety, and manufacturing quality. In the 25 years of ICH, there have been numerous ICH guidelines that have been agreed by the ICH partners. These are all available on the ICH website. They have been implemented, and really the idea in the ICH when it was first founded, and which has been the idea throughout, is that they will only take on a topic if the various partners agree, the regulatory partners agree, that if there is consensus and agreement on a guideline, they will then go back and implement that guideline through whatever mechanism they need to within their own systems. So if there is something that needs to be taken up that, for example, requires a change in the law in one of the partners, generally that is not accepted as a topic because the regulators, as you remember from the first module, don't have the authority to change the law in their countries. They can change the regulations, they can change the guidances, but if one of the regulators would have had to have changed their law in order to implement a change or to deal with a certain issue, then that would not be considered within scope for ICH. ICH, though, in 25 years, and particularly in the last 4 to 5 years, has really begun to undergo some major changes that reflect the changes in the pharmaceutical landscape, and in reality, to reflect the changes that have been brought about by the globalization realities that we've been talking about. There have been new members participating in the ICH procedures. There is a new organizational structure. There is a new governance now compared to what it used to be. But it is still focused primarily on these technical and process harmonization initiatives that go around the technical requirements for registration. Although actually this idea of registration in the ICH context is obviously broader in that we're talking about clinical trials, we're talking about the assessment piece, and also there is a good deal of guidance on post-authorization and pharmacovigilance. There are, for your information, analogous organizations to ICH that exist for regulators of animal drugs. It's called VICH, or Veterinary International Conference on Harmonization. There is one for medical devices, and there's one for cosmetics. One of the things, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that came out of the ICH process was the fact that regulators who previously had really not had any formal or informal interactions with each other to any great degree have developed a much deeper means of bilateral relationships that are not only at the senior executive level or at the international programs level, but that now are down into the technical areas of the agencies. And you see a tremendous amount of, we'll talk about in a few minutes, interactions and data exchange and idea exchange that are happening up and down these agencies and across agencies because of the work of ICH, where in the ICH working groups, many of the people in the agencies, the technical experts in the agencies, were the members and are the members of the technical working groups. And in these small working groups that draft and ultimately develop consensus on the ICH guidelines, they at the same time have developed very close personal and very close working relationships that have spilled over and that are continuing to spill over into the way the agencies are working together bilaterally that previously they had never done to anywhere near the extent that goes on now. As I said, 20 years ago, regulators who shared information directly with each other were the exception, not the rule. And yet we've gone from a situation 25 years ago where there was even discussion about whether regulators could share information with each other to a world now where this has become a normal daily part of the way regulators do their business and is considered a necessary best practice when we think about how we regulate drugs in the 21st century. Along these lines, I think people would say that this kind of regulatory collaboration is no longer nice to do. It's no longer discretionary, as it was back in the 1980s and early 1990s, but it has evolved now into a situation where it is an integral part of how every national agency should be doing its work, and in many cases is doing its work. Because it's only in this way can an agency really do the best job possible for its people, given the contingencies of the globalized world in which they are now working. But as you can imagine, this doesn't just happen overnight. This requires an investment in time, it requires an investment in people and money, but it can have a very positive return. And particularly the responsibilities within these agencies of building cadres of people who understand the international context and can be the conduit for helping to build relationships and helping to understand the differences and the nuances in the way people use language and what the same word means in different contexts. So you see the investment that these agencies have put over the past 25 years in trying to build an internal infrastructure to support this new way of doing business when, as you can imagine, there never was such an infrastructure. There was never need for such an infrastructure in these agencies in the past. When we talk about data sharing and the fact that agencies now share data on a routine basis, I wanted to tell you a little bit about kind of how this data sharing goes on and what kind of data is shared and in what situations, and really a little bit about what people do with the data once they share it. There is kind of routine data sharing where agencies have agreed that certain kinds of data on a routine basis will be shared with each other, such as, for example, what applications you're working on at a given period in time. There are clearly ad hoc information where a group will be working on a certain topic. They want to share information. They want to get the opinion of their peers about a certain information, and they will have an ad hoc exchange. And then clearly there are the situations where we have emergencies either within a country or an international public health emergency where there is a tremendous amount of data and sharing and discussion that goes on among regulators to try to deal with the emergency situation. One of the things that I think is important to remember when we talk about the value in data sharing is that you have to remember in each country, the regulatory authority is really the only group of people within that country who do that job. There really is no one else in the United States, for example, who does the job of the regulators that are at FDA. However, there are people in other countries who are doing essentially the same kind of job as the reviewers and the others, the technical experts at FDA are doing. So when you think about the world of science, where you think the validity of what you do in science is really based on peer review and being able for your peers to comment on what you're doing, really when it comes to regulation and regulatory science, within a jurisdiction, you have no peers. There's no one else that you can go to in your own jurisdiction who is really wearing your shoes and is faced with the same issue in the same way that you're faced with. So if you want to have peer review, if you want to have peer discussion, you have to go outside your jurisdiction. And within the information sharing that goes on, whether it's written information, digital information, verbal information, much of it is really done in a way to have the kind of peer review and peer interaction that people who have been raised in the world of science are used to having as a way of validating and actually bouncing ideas off of people who are in the same situation that you're in. So the way that this kind of data sharing and information sharing goes on is both in an informal way and a formal way. And you can see on this slide a list of ways that have been developed over the past 25 years for information to be exchanged. There are confidentiality arrangements that I'll talk about in a minute that allow regulators to exchange confidential information of certain kinds between each other. Between, for example, the US FDA and EMA, and now also in many bringing Health Canada and Japan into it, have been created what are called clusters. And these are basically working groups that are virtual working groups of the technical assessors who are looking at drugs that are being developed or that are being overseen for different categories of products. And I've listed some here. For example, vaccines. There's also an oncology cluster and a pediatrics cluster and an advanced therapies cluster and a generics cluster and an orphans cluster and many others where the regulators who are indeed focusing on these products on a day-to-day basis in these various regulatory agencies have a mechanism, an ongoing formal mechanism whereby they share a tremendous amount of information about what they're doing and the thoughts and the challenges and some of the approaches that they're taking with their peers in some of these other regulatory agencies. We have, as I mentioned in the last module, the situation where there is staff from the EMA that is permanently embedded in FDA and staff from the FDA that are permanently embedded in EMA. And so you have people who are exchanging information clearly on a daily basis in a very focused in-house way and who are a resource to the other agency for what is going on in their home agency, and particularly explaining kind of how their home agency does what they do, who in their home agency is responsible for it, and really creating a very in-depth link between the agencies. As I mentioned, they talk about ongoing assessments, they talk about and have joint reviews and joint inspections. Clearly the issues of safety after a product is authorized and the new safety information, data is coming in from all over the world. People are looking for safety signals that need further investigation or further messaging, and there's a lot of discussion between the agencies on what those data are, what those signals might be, and what the appropriate messages to the larger global community might be. There are public hearings, advisory committees that we have here in the United States to which regulators from other agencies come or participate in by the video conferences or watch them through some of the webcasting that goes on. So there are a lot of formal ways that information is shared, and as I've mentioned, a lot of informal ways through emails and calls between people who now know each other as peers and who have developed a tremendous amount of trust at the personal and organizational levels. I mentioned the confidentiality arrangements, and these were kind of some of the really groundbreaking, I think, tools that allowed us to get from this idea of whether regulatory agencies really could talk with each other or not. Because, as you know, one of the fundamental premises of regulatory agencies, particularly in the high-income countries, is that the information you receive from the manufacturer contains a lot of trade secret information, it contains a tremendous amount of commercial confidential information, and that information is held in trust by the regulator because the companies have no choice but to give the regulator that information, but it is with the legal proviso that the regulatory agency will indeed respect the confidentiality of that information and not allow competitors or others to get access to the information such that it could be used in a way that a competitor could harm the proprietary data that the manufacturer has. So this idea of how can you exchange this information and still at the same time be faithful to your legal obligations to maintain the confidentiality of the data that the companies are required to submit. And this is where the confidentiality arrangements come into being, and the legal provisions that FDA and other organizations have that allow them to go into arrangements that allow the exchange of certain kinds of confidential information. What in the United States and in many other countries, what is not allowed to be shared is what is called trade secret information. And generally, at a very high level, that's basically the formula for the product. This is a very much a chemical kind of element. And in many situations, this does not come into play because in the dossiers that are submitted to both agencies, that information has already been submitted. What is allowed, and what is much more important when we're talking about the data that are in the clinical trials, the data that are in the animal toxicology work, is the commercial confidential information. So people are allowed to share that. People are allowed to share, for example, FDA can discuss what its thoughts are on an action that it might take, or what its thoughts are on a guidance that it might put out with regulatory peers around the world with whom they have a confidential information, and that does not constitute FDA talking about it publicly. Because once FDA talks about something publicly, then it's open for anybody to have. But talking to a regulator under a confidentiality arrangement does not make that talk public, and so FDA can use this kind of peer interaction to talk about actions before they happen or guidances before they're made truly public. We're able to share information on compliance and investigative information. We exchange staff both at a secondment level, training, and at the liaison placements that we've already talked about. And it allows our experts to attend closed meetings in Europe, and it allows European experts and experts from others with whom we have confidentiality arrangements to attend closed meetings in the United States. The benefits of this, obviously, are the increased ability to converge and to align and to understand. It supports, from the industry side, the development of global development plans so that when there's understanding in the various agencies as to what needs to be done in order to actually develop a product in a global sense, there can be a wider discussion and a wider consensus on a truly global development plan. And it also develops this early dialogue between manufacturers and the regulators, not only at a national level, but at an international level, which clearly is something that the globalized world we're in now is actually causing to happen and necessitating to happen. And this is the tool that allows that to happen. As I said, these kind of arrangements have basically formed the foundation for the interaction with our peers and allows people in regulatory agencies to have the kind of peer-to-peer interaction that people who have been raised in the world of science are used to and require for the validation of their work. This is just a list of examples of countries with whom FDA has, or they're not with the countries, but with the regulatory authorities in these countries that FDA has confidentiality arrangements with. The real requirement is that indeed the country with whom you have a confidentiality arrangement has within its own law and its own system and its own history the ability to maintain the information confidential, just as that information would be held confidential in the United States and vice versa. The place where this becomes really quite challenging is the move for greater transparency in many parts of the world, the freedom of information law that we have in the US, the access to information laws that are now in Europe and many other countries, and having to look at how those laws interdigitate with the confidentiality commitments that people make and whether information might be made available in another country that would not be made available in a previous country are things that the lawyers and people have to look at very closely when they are looking at these particular confidentiality arrangements. And again, the impact of, as we go further into the 21st century, the greater and greater desire for transparency in not only how decisions are made, but into the data behind them, and when the data behind them are made available, whether it's made available early or later, are questions that are still being negotiated and questions that are still obviously causing challenges on how people work together and maintain both the public good policy of transparency and the public good that comes out of being able to keep certain information confidential so that indeed companies can develop and have innovation and get the kind of protection that is needed in order to keep innovation moving and providing us with products that we need going forward. There's also a growing number of multilateral cooperation. What we've been talking about, as you've seen, is a lot of bilateral cooperation, but under things such as ICH and these various harmonization initiatives, people began to not only have the bilateral, but also you see the proliferation of multilateral cooperation initiatives. And you see three at the bottom here that are written in red. And these are newer initiatives that are now coming forward. One is the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Forum, which is an offshoot part of ICH that is bringing more and more regulators into the ICH process in different ways. There's the International Generic Drugs Regulators pilot, which is trying to do within the world of generic drugs a lot of what has happened within the world of innovator drugs under ICH and VICH. And then one called the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, which is a newer idea that is yet still quite nascent, which is looking at a way to bring the chief executive officers of the major agencies around the world into a much more formal organization, such that they can indeed provide the strategic oversight of all of the harmonization that's going on with their individual agencies. As I mentioned, this ICMRA is thought to be a possible major future player. I think it's something people will want to keep an eye on as we go further into the 21st century. This is an idea that began about 3 years ago. It now involves some 19 countries plus the European Union across various regions of the world. It includes many of the major high-income countries and many of the major middle-income countries coming into it. It is at this point in time a virtual organization with the members having committed to provide resources. The Secretariat, which is actually managing the development of this particular organization, is at the current time run by Health Canada. There are 7 working groups that are looking at governance. They're looking at mapping of activities. They're looking at communication, at information sharing, at good manufacturing practice inspections, at generic medicinal products, and at capacity building. And this is all an effort, as I said, to really try to figure out what at a chief executive officer at a strategic level. It's not trying to replace in any way the technical work that is done in ICH and others, but with the widening of the international cooperation, both at a bilateral and a multilateral level, the feeling was that there needed to be some way that the chief executive officers could have a forum and a platform for their own ability to align and to make sure that the resources and the focus of what their staff were doing in this world of cooperation were indeed aligned and focused on what, from a strategic perspective, they were trying to accomplish during their time as chief executive officer of the various regulatory agencies. And this is not really a new idea. If you look at other sectors, particularly if you look at the airline safety sector, if you think about international air travel, this is something that went through globalization about 50 years ago. And people began to realize at that point in time that airlines from country A were going to be flying into country B. And you had to have a way, once it landed in country B and it took on citizens of country B, the airline regulator in country B needed to be able somehow to know that those pilots were trained, that the airplane was maintained in the way it should be, so that its citizens, when they boarded that plane in their own country, could be reassured that this was a rational, safe thing to do. So the countries that were involved and had airlines that were involved in international travel came together in the middle part of the 20th century and formed an organization called ICAO, which is a United Nations organization, which really does look at global airline safety standards and has a way of auditing the regulatory authorities in various countries that oversee airline safety and make sure that they are applying the international standards, so that when a plane flies into a country from one of these countries that has been assessed as having an acceptable airline safety program, the country that it came into doesn't have to spend its resources looking at and retesting the pilot and making sure the plane has been maintained, because they're able to rely on what happened here. And so I think this is a nice segue when you think about what the world has done in trying to rationalize the resources and the reality of the global industry of airlines and the safety of international airlines. There are a lot of lessons that can be learned when we talk about the globalization of the pharmaceutical industry and the issues of assuring safety of products that are traveling internationally from country to country, just as the world has done with airlines that are traveling from country to country.